Thank you very much. It is a delight to be here. Thank you for arranging the beautiful weather. Thank you for your hospitality. It is my first visit to Riga, and when I was walking around yesterday, I just found the whole place delightful, but there was a little question in my mind, where is everyone? I'd just come from London, actually, a couple of meetings in London, and when you go out in London, even if you're going to a kind of work meeting, you're somehow dodging people all the way down the street and trying to avoid being tripped up by anyone. I wasn't tripped up by anybody. It was fantastic. But the question remained, where are you all? And then this is where you are. So thank you again for coming in crowds to listen to me. I still find it a little bit odd. What I'm presenting is a sort of a heretical view from a conventional viewpoint, and I totally accept that. For me, what I want to do is to say a little bit about where that came from in my work, to sketch that challenge to a conventional viewpoint in its origins. And then I want to develop, sometimes historically, sometimes philosophically, sometimes thematically, I want to develop the idea of a kind of alternative viewpoint. And this alternative viewpoint is not a fully finished product that we could take out and use and put into policy tomorrow. It is very much, as Martens was describing it, a pebble dropped in a pond that might create some ripples. And those ripples are supposed to be, with the best intentions, a challenge for us to think differently about a world in which the challenges around us are already enormous. And so this ability to think differently, this ability to think otherwise, has a kind of premium if we want to address those challenges. So this idea is encapsulated really in the title of my talk, Prosperity is Health. Our conventional view of prosperity is actually, in English, differs by one letter, wealth. That's normally how we might think about prosperity, as wealth, as income, and in particular as growth in that income. And I want to pose this idea that prosperity may be more about health than about wealth from the perspective of work that I was doing when I was a government advisor in the UK some 10 to 14 years ago. And we opened the discussion at that time with a fairly obvious challenge from a sustainability perspective. The economy is structured around growth. Our vision of prosperity is structured around more and more the accumulation of wealth, the growth of income, and yet we are living on a finite planet. Our task as a commission to the government was to think about sustainability in that context and to recognize that actually there are places where the limited nature of the planet may already be coming up against the expansion of the economy, where our impact on the planet is already causing some issues. And at the time, and subsequently, of course, one of the most obvious is the question of climate change. But there are a number of other issues. Our impact on the planet destroys other species. The Living Planet Index has declined by 75% in the last 50 years. We're losing other species. The soils are degrading. There's plastic in every part of the world. There's pollution in the seas. There's sewage in our rivers. There is a set of challenges associated with the finite nature of the material world in which we live, which are constantly coming up against what you might call the growth imperative, this idea that our prosperity depends on economic growth and that economic growth is something that should continue. So this was always a difficult challenge. It was a particularly difficult challenge for the government that I was reporting to, but it's remained a difficult challenge. And I'm not here to pretend to you that it's an easy challenge. I'm here to present some ideas about how we have done things, how we may have done things not with the best outcomes, and how we could potentially do things differently. That work that I described for the Sustainable Development Commission for the UK government culminated in this book, Prosperity Without Growth. And there was a long discussion as we developed the work about the title itself. We were a government commission challenging one of the most fundamental axioms of policy, the idea of economic growth. And there were lots of people who thought maybe we shouldn't actually say that in the title because it's a little bit too provocative. Maybe we could call it Beyond Growth, or maybe we could call it Prosperity with Growth, or maybe we could call it Growth with Prosperity. Maybe there were other iterations. In the end, what we settled on was a question mark. Prosperity without growth, question mark. So it was posed as a sort of open question. And this was perceived to be actually a reasonable compromise that would satisfy our paymasters, would not rile too many feathers, and would allow us to publish the report. That failed, sadly. There were a few ruffled feathers, I have to say, a little bit of disagreement, a little bit of disapproval that a government advisor had been questioning the idea of economic growth. And so when the publisher came along and said, actually, we'd like to put this in a book form, we decided to do away with the question mark altogether. The publisher wanted to put an exclamation mark there, but we settled in the end with just Prosperity Without Growth, Foundations for the Economy of Tomorrow. But it is still, and it remains a kind of invitation. It remains a kind of a question. Of course, we've always depended on economic growth. Of course, it has done good things for society. Of course, poor people in poor countries around the world still need more in the way of income. And I will show you some of the evidence for that. And yet we are left with that central challenge that the expansion of the economy on a finite planet runs up against the idea of limits. That's where the work came from. The report itself had a lot of technical stuff in it about the potential for decoupling the expansion of the economy from the impacts on the environment, for example. And it also went into a little bit of the detail of what kind of an economy we might build if we thought about the idea of prosperity from scratch. And it was published at a time just after the financial crisis, where there was actually a lot of interest in the idea that maybe we should rethink economics for some fairly obvious reasons. The financial crisis had revealed flaws in financial management, in asset management, in fiscal policy, in monetary policy. It had revealed that actually we were living, in spite of the incredible rates of growth that were experienced at that time, we were living on a castle of sand with weak foundations. And when you delved a little bit deeper into that, you actually found that actually basic elements of economics had been subverted in some way. So work, for example, which could be a good thing in society, had become for many people a form of servitude. Enterprise, which is the way in which we organize production to meet the needs of people, had become a sort of vehicle, or the vision of enterprise was a vehicle for accumulation. Investment, and this was a key issue with the financial crisis, instead of being some foundation for our continuity in the future, had become speculative, had become what many people called a casino economy. Ability for those who were lucky in the draw to make huge amounts of money, and yet not always investing in assets that supported the well-being of people. And ultimately, even money itself, a form of power in society. And a part of my dream for prosperity without growth is that economics itself could look within at the way these constructs were built and how they were prosecuted, and ask the question, are they fit for purpose? Could they be otherwise? Could we think about economics itself differently, about the tools in the toolbox differently? What is work? What is its foundation? What is its role in society? How should we think about enterprise? What is the role, the fundamental nature of investment? And even what is this thing called money that underlies and seems to drive so much of it? And these ideas of reformulation led me towards, if you like, just proposals. What if enterprise is not the continual digging up of material resources from the earth, the fast manufacture of products that you can sell as many of as possible in ever-expanding markets, hope that they fall apart quickly so that you can throw them away. What if it's not that? What if it is actually the service that entrepreneurs themselves feel is their purpose in the world? And when you think about enterprise as service rather than mass production of products, actually you end up with a different view of which kinds of enterprises are in the service of humanity and which may actually simply be in the service of profiteering and damage in society. Investment was an obvious one to rethink. And in a sense, my call, my ask in Prosperity Without Growth around investment is that we reframe investment as a commitment to the future. That is the fundamental nature of investment. We don't spend everything today. We set stuff aside so that we can ensure continuity in the future. It's a basic aspect of human prudence. And it had been subverted under what people call late-stage capitalism to become something entirely acquisitive, or almost entirely acquisitive. Real investment itself in the architecture of the economy had fallen. It had become a speculative process of finance, investing in finance for the interests of finance, with the assumption that that would benefit society as a whole. The financial crisis told us that it was a dangerous thing to do, and that we had lost sight of the basic idea of investment as a commitment, as our social commitment to the future. So these were the ideas that I began to put together in Prosperity Without Growth. And they imply that we have to rethink economics. I framed that rethinking here as the idea of developing a kind of post-growth economics, a post-growth macroeconomics. Now, that might seem a bit premature in a world in which we still seem to be chasing growth. But actually, the reality is that the growth rates that we experienced in the 1960s and 1970s have steadily been declining since that time. And it's not a function of the financial crisis. It's not a function of COVID. It's actually a long-term steady decline in the growth rates that you can trace back to the middle of the 1960s. In my country, in the UK, labour productivity growth, which is the foundation for economic growth, has been declining since 1966. And in particular, over the last years, has been almost stagnant, if not negative. And that is not a foundation for growth. In other words, we are already living to some extent in a post-growth society, and yet we're still almost obsessed with the idea that growth is the thing that will save us from all the troubles that we experience. In a world without any environmental limits, that might be an unfortunate misunderstanding of a long-term stagnation in the growth rates. In a world with environmental limits and with social differences, it becomes a very dangerous philosophy, the pursuit of something which is increasingly difficult to find, instead of turning our solutions and our eyes to other directions, to ask more fundamental questions about what the goal of prosperity, of human prosperity, really is. Can it really be growth for growth's sake? Of course not. And even mainstream economists and mainstream politicians rarely characterize it as growth for growth's sake. But they still assume that it's growth for everything else's sake. And if we don't have growth, then our world will fall apart, our prosperity will fall apart, well-being will be impossible, it will be impossible to govern, and so on and so forth. When I started this work, I sometimes felt as though what I was doing was teasing an intellectual thread and being confronted with what I would call impossibility theorems. Everywhere you turn, when you question that idea that growth is the foundation for civility, for civilization, for well-being, for society, for governance, you're presented with what I would call impossibility theorems. No, it's impossible to do without growth, because what will we do about the welfare state? What will we do about pensions? What will we do about people's jobs? There wouldn't be enough employment for people. Impossibility theorem after impossibility theorem. That's fair enough if it all worked, but it hasn't been working. And so in some sense, I think our job is to peel back the layers of the onion, to challenge the impossibility theorems and to go back into some first principles. And my idea doesn't mean that there isn't work to do. It means there is more work to do. There is different work to do. There is a different way of thinking about those economic concepts of work, enterprise, investment, money. We have to ask questions that we haven't necessarily been asking before, haven't had to ask before, but we must take them seriously as a research agenda, as a policy agenda, as a way of engaging society in a conversation about the kind of society we want to be, the kind of prosperity we want to have. Economics must become a discipline that is accessible to everybody who wants to ask those questions, and they pertain to all of us. They're not disciplinary or specialist questions. They are questions that pertain to the most fundamental things about our lives. And if there is one challenge from me to economics, the economics as I've seen it develop, is that that is not something that should hide behind a veil of ignorance or of discipline or of specialism or of complexity. It is something, economics is something in which we should engage as a society on an everyday level, because that is its fundamental task. So that's by way of the background. Let me go back philosophically and back to this idea that perhaps prosperity has more to do with health than it does with wealth as conventionally measured. And the interesting thing about this is that as soon as you open up the idea, you have a lot of support for it. Support in the literature, support in poetry, support in the spiritual traditions, but support also with ordinary people on the street. I mean, I've put up a few quotes here. The first wealth is health. There is no wealth but life. These were both social philosophers. Rumi, the Persian poet from several centuries ago, I went looking for my wealth and found it was my health. That is a message that actually our work in CUSP, in the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, has reinforced over and over again, that when you ask people what matters most in their lives, health comes consistently at or near the top of the list. The idea that prosperity is about health is not a stupid one. It's a perfectly reasonable one. It's a one that many people would associate with the health, my own health, the health of my family, the health of my kids, the health of my community, the health of my society, the health of my planet. Health is a very interesting metaphor for prosperity. And just mention here very briefly that the word prosperity, which has Latin roots, prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and our expectations, it has been cashed out in our society as income, and that's what matters. But actually, when you ask people about their hopes and aspirations, quite often health is closer to the top of their list. Now, what's interesting about this switch, just a switch of one letter in the English language from wealth to health, is that it has a very different dynamic. And I want to pause and think about that a little bit, because it's an important element, both in understanding where our growth-based economy might have gone wrong, but also in understanding how we need to fix it. So this is a picture, a graph of life expectancy against income per capita. It comes from the book, so it's a little bit, the data are a little bit older now, but broadly speaking, they haven't changed the overall picture, which is, and if you are an advocate of growth, you will certainly pick up on this point, that as you go from having next to nothing in sub-Saharan Africa to having around about $20,000 or so per capita, your life expectancy, which is the value on the vertical axis, practically doubles. Growth is doing the work of prosperity at low incomes. And that should never be forgotten. If you give more income to someone in sub-Saharan Africa, rural sub-Saharan Africa in particular, you give them more access to energy, to food, to shelter, to choice in life. You give them access to prosperity. But then a very interesting thing happens after that point, and this is pushing us towards this shift in dynamic that I want I want to emphasize. After a certain point, round about $20,000 per capita in 2010 dollars, that relationship changes, and it changes substantially. It flattens off and even sometimes goes into reverse. So, for example, in my own country, in the UK, I don't know if I can navigate this pointer, you can see it roughly there. We have a life expectancy that's lower than the life expectancy in countries with a fraction of the income per capita. So Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile are in a sort of sweet spot up here. And countries like the US, the UK, Ireland have lower life expectancies. Now, if income were a reliable indicator of prosperity as life expectancy ad infinitum, you would not expect to see that pattern. So the pattern challenges the reality. In case you're interested in where Latvia is on that, I did identify it. I apologize that the name is not on there, but it is roughly where my red spot is there. So sort of on the curve, but, and again, remember these are essentially 2014 data expressed as 2010 prices, so this doesn't equate to the income per capita today, but it does give a sense of the idea that life expectancy in Latvia is not as high as some other countries with the same level of income. Those are all things really to just hold in your mind for now, because I want to come back to framing this idea that if we think about prosperity as health, it isn't simply a question of increasing income or increasing wealth. Something else is at play, a non-linear relationship. And that non-linear relationship is really important to understand and to think about. But the obvious corollary of thinking about prosperity as health is to ask the question, well, if health is our outcome, then what do we want the economy to be doing? Should we not perhaps think of it actually as a form of care, as what maintains health for us, or what nourishes us, and what brings us back to health? And I like this definition here, care as an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. Two ideas, prosperity as health, economy as care. They change the way that we frame the problem. And in changing the way that we frame the problem, they open up different avenues for exploring how we achieve prosperity in our world. I want to push further on this idea that there's a change in dynamic at play. And the change in dynamic is broadly captured by this, that health is broadly a balance. There is nothing, very little in nature or in health, that continues to accumulate and accumulate. More is a concept that has meaning within health when you don't have enough, but the continual accumulation of more and more is not a dynamic that suits health very well. On the contrary, health is really about balance, about remaining with a narrow range of parameters that a successful organism can expect to survive and thrive within. And this idea goes back to the early founders of physiology, the study of organisms and the health of organisms. Claude Bernard, a French physiologist, was one of the founders of that discipline. All the vital mechanisms, and he's talking now about the vital mechanisms in the physical organism, all the vital mechanisms, however varied they may be, always have one purpose, that of maintaining the integrity of the conditions of life with the internal environment. What's going on inside us has to remain within a narrow range. Our blood pressure, our temperature, our breathing rate, our heart rate, these parameters, our glucose level, our dopamine level, these are constantly being regulated in a process that Walter Cannon, a few years later, described as homeostasis, a homeostatic mechanism bringing us back into balance. Health in the body is not a process of continual growth. It's a process of bringing things back into balance within certain limits. It is a different dynamic from the dynamic of growth. And the problem with the dynamic of growth is this, that if you are continually intent on having more, you miss the point of enough. You miss that point of balance. And even if you happen to see the point of balance, you're unable to stop when you get there because the system itself is driving you towards more. A fundamentally different dynamic. Something going on at the heart of our society, the heart of our organization of social life, at the heart of our economics, that is blinding us to the idea of health. It's not just not looking at health, it's blinding us to that idea because the dynamic of health is about balance, the dynamic of growth is about accumulation, about more. And in those circumstances, actually, it's worth thinking a little more clearly about what care is and what it means. When I sat down to write the book, The Care Economy, which is my most recent attempt to understand these ideas, I struggled with the idea of care. Care, in English at least, is a difficult word. It means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. It's often moralized. So the care is seen as something irredeemably good. So when I'm talking about the care economy, then I must be, trying to, convey to everyone my moral worth because I'm someone who cares. And I think that's a problematic aspect of the word care. And it does insufficient justice to the concept of care itself. And I was struggling with this, actually, as I was writing the book, and I was out for a walk one night, and I found myself I would quite often take myself to the coast of Wales. I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's a very rugged coast outside of civilization. It has something primeval to it. And as I was sitting there with these ideas around care and prosperity in my head, I could see the moon rising in the ocean. And a question popped into my head. Does the moon care? It was a curious thing, and the curious things happen when you're trying to write that kind of stuff, when you're trying to write any kind of stuff. And at first I just dismissed it and thought, well, Tim, you need to go and take a break from all this. You're obviously going slightly crazy. Does the moon care? Of course the moon doesn't care. The moon is an inanimate object in the sky. What could it care about? And then I challenged myself to ask that question a little bit further. If the moon cared, in what sense could it be described as caring? And there you're in a very different state of mind. For example, the moon is constantly at attention. It's constantly there. It doesn't go away. It stays with us. Thank goodness, because it plays absolutely vital roles in balance. The balance of the tides, for example, come in and out regularly, predictably, because of the movement of the moon, the presence of the moon. And that coming in and out of the tides allows for a small region where the land is sometimes covered by the water and sometimes open. And that land is where our ancestors crawled out of the ocean onto the land too. The moon regulated our existence. It actually provided our existence as a species. It constantly regulates our climate by its inclination around its axis to the sun that keeps our climate temperate till now. Climate change apart. And in this sense, in the sense of the moon paying attention and providing a fundamental balance, it seemed to me that we could begin to think about the moon as caring. But that care had suddenly attained a very specific meaning. It was about paying attention and attention to balance, to the point of balance. Not just that, but restoring us continually to the point of balance. The tides come in, the tides go out. They all oscillate around a mean. The low point of the spring tides is defined as. And that change is always happening. But the force is the constant force of restoration around a point of balance. And that metaphor, it was at that point just a metaphor, but actually when I began to look at the physiology, the same thing happens. Our autonomic nervous system, as it's called, constantly regulates our bodies around many, many different points of balance within the body, and it's constantly doing it. We don't even know it's happening. We're not conscious of it. It's just happening. It's something that happens as a part of the survival mechanism of organic beings. It is a fundamental organizing principle of organic life. And that's extraordinary. And yet that process suffers within our economic and social system. I'll come back to when the tide is receding from the beach, because you will understand it better when I do. But in summary, this is where the care economy came out for me. Those two principles, very simple: prosperity is health, economy is care. And I also began to think through, actually, and this also has its roots in prosperity without growth, that this idea of the care economy gives us a focus for what I would call the post-growth transition. The way of thinking about a transition from a growth-dependent, growth-focused economics and economic system and economic policy to one which is focused more around health. And I want to show you, again, this is some data analysis which shows why there are characteristics of this care economy that are a good thing. And the first of those characteristics is displayed by the vertical axis of my graph, which is the carbon emissions per unit of what economists call final demand. And the horizontal axis is the employment intensity of that same final demand, different kinds of commodities, services, products in society. So vertical axis carbon, horizontal axis people. What you look at when you look at, and this is for the OECD economies, is a pattern that looks something like this. Different sectors have different carbon intensities, they have different employment intensities. Not surprisingly, manufactured goods have quite a high carbon intensity, a middling employment intensity. Tech and finance on the left-hand corner there, the brown one, you'll see that it has, at least at this point in time, relatively low carbon material intensity, and very low, by comparison, very low employment intensity. So it's not employing many people in the economy, but it is also not that dirty at the moment. I'm sure anyone who's followed the debate around AI and data services will challenge the sustainability of that, because that sort of intensity of data provision for AI is one of the reasons why AI and tech isn't quite as clean as we would like it to be. But the thing that I want to draw your attention to rather is this set of activities here on the on the right-hand side of my diagram towards the bottom. Arts and recreation, hospitality, health and social care, education, public administration, other kinds of services, service-based activities. And so what we're looking at here is a set of activities with inherently low environmental impact and inherently high employment potential. And it's also the case that actually in many of those activities, the quality of work satisfaction is high, because people in the service of people, and that speaks to something about human beings in the service of each other. It has a sense of purpose to it, which some of the jobs in the supermarket economy or the mass production economy simply don't have. In other words, it again brings us to this idea that in pursuing activities that focus on our health, on our well-being, we actually have something of the foundation for a different kind of economy. An economy that's less environmentally intensive, an economy that's more satisfying in its work, an economy that could employ people. Now that's, obviously we still need some stuff, we still need food, we can't get away with that, but we can think of it as a direction of travel, a place where with high employment intensity and low carbon intensity, we could begin to envisage a different kind of economy. I want to park for now, because I'm sure someone will raise it, the question of how much planning has to go in to achieve that. It isn't a call to abandon the market altogether. It's a call to rethink prosperity, to rethink the basis of the economy, and then to think about the mechanisms for achieving it. It's so obvious in some sense. These two ideas are so obvious. That prosperity has a lot to do with health, that if health is the goal, then surely care should be what the economy is doing. What else could it be doing? It's so obvious that you're left with a couple of other pretty serious questions. One is, why doesn't it happen? Why does that not happen? And the other is, of course, what should we do about it? I was throughout the writing, driven by that what should we do about it question, again, until I stumbled on something which helped me enormously, a little bit like the moon did in the conceptual framing. This is a question in a book called The Age of Insecurity, The Wisdom of Insecurity, by a philosopher called Alan Watts. And he said the question, what should we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. To understand the problem and to know what to do about it are the same thing, if the problem can be solved, he said. And that's, I would have loved to have that as an advice when I was giving advice to government ministers, I have to say, with prosperity without growth, because I was continually confronted with what would you like us to do? What do we do on Monday with these ideas? And so I could envisage myself saying, well, you know, if you don't know what to do, then you don't understand the problem. It's a little bit flippant, but it has a reality to it. And so the understanding of the problem is paramount. And here, just for a few minutes, I kind of want to get a little bit philosophical about understanding the problem and go right back to the ideas of antiquity in relation to care. This is a picture of the goddess Care, Roman goddess Cura. And it encapsulates something called the myth of Care, which was written by a historiographer in around about 100 years of the new era, who was called Gaius Julius Hyginus. And it basically set out the origin story of humanity according to this myth. The origin story was the goddess Care is sitting with her friend Terra, the goddess of the earth, one day, absent-mindedly sculpting mud. And she happens to come up with a little figurine, a doll, a mud figure. And she kind of looks at this figure and says, wouldn't it be great if it could talk and walk and breathe and write books and stuff like that? And then she said, who do I know who could breathe life into it? And she called her friend, the god Jupiter, over to breathe life into it. And he breathed life into it, but he wanted, in exchange, he wanted naming rights. He wanted it to be named after him. And Care sort of said, no way, that's not right. So they appealed to Terra, and Terra said, well, where did you get the mud from? And Care said, well, I got it from you. You gave it to me. You said I could play with it. And so Terra, well, it should have my name. And they couldn't resolve the dispute, so they appealed to Saturn. And Saturn said something pretty wise. Saturn was actually a reasonably, he was the father of Jupiter, but he'd been thrown over in favor of the power of Jupiter in the Roman mythology. And he said, well, you know, the mud comes from you, Terra, so you can have it back when it dies. And the spirit was breathed in by you, Jupiter, so you can have its spirit back when you die. And Care, who had formed this creature, was thinking, well, what do I get out of this? What do I get? And Saturn says, you, my dear, get to love and nurture and cherish this being for the rest of its life. And the story, and of course it is just a story, and it goes counter to the idea that actually it was Leviathan who created the human species, but we'll get on to gender a little bit later. The story is supposed to give us this sense of the absolute essential nature of care to the survival of the organism, to human life, something quintessential. And that quintessential nature was picked up by philosophers. The story goes that this myth of Hyginus was picked up by Goethe, for example, and the last act of the second part of Faust. Care enters into Faust's dialogue as one of four grey women, the only one of those four grey women, come to warn him about the future. And she's the only one who manages to get through to Faust, never looked for, always there, cursed and flattered. I am Care. Have I never crossed your path? And that realization was the beginning of the turnaround for Faust, actually, in terms of the end of Goethe's projection of the story, and became a part of a mythology and a literature around care, which persisted to some extent for a while. To go back a little bit to the Roman mythology again, the gods of health, I'm going to talk to you about Asclepius, who was the father, ancient Greek god of medicine, also in Roman mythology the same, and his daughter, Hygeia, sometimes wife, sometimes daughter, but definitely female, the ancient Greek god of health, cleanliness, and sanitation. Hygeia gives us the English word hygiene. Asclepius, the rod of Asclepius, this staff with the snake wound round it that you see in the picture here, gives us the motif for the World Health Organization even today. Nobody was quite clear on the meaning of the snake itself, but I just want to draw attention to an interesting thing about the snake in these two pictures. In the rod of Asclepius, the snake is wound around the rod, almost subjugated by it. In the picture of Hygeia, and the traditional sculpture of Hygeia, Hygeia is nourishing the snake, nurturing the snake. Some people feel that the snake itself is disease, in which case one of these things is about subjugating disease and the other is about nourishing disease. The idea that we nourish disease is a very strange one, but it has some distinct roots in medical history as well. The idea that disease, as we see it, the symptoms of disease are actually a part of the healing process of the body healing itself. And so nourishing, nurturing the idea of disease is a different way of thinking about health. So you have two, you might call them complementary gods. You have a traditional god of healing as the subjugation of disease, another one which is about care, about maintenance, about restoration, about nourishment. Hygeia and care obviously have a lot in common. What happened over time, and this is the point of my little excursion into mythology, is that became increasingly about the cult of Asclepius. It became a part of a vision for health, which was about the control of disease and increasingly the pharmaceutical control of disease. And that shift in its turn was exacerbated by this dispute between two chemists, both French chemists, a dispute around the origins of disease, pathogenesis. What is the genesis of disease? Where does it come from? And the dominant theory in the late 19th century and early 20th century owes most to Louis Pasteur, the same Louis Pasteur who was responsible for pasteurization of milk, for example. And the theory goes, germs cause disease. If you kill the germ, you remove the disease. So the job of medicine is to design things which kill germs. And a lot of that happened in laboratories, and a lot of it was deemed to be very, very successful. But it was challenged by a different idea that what matters for health is the ability of the organism to resist the germ, and that depends on the terrain. Disease occurs when the terrain, the internal environment that we heard about before from Claude Bernard, is weakened. If you have a weak terrain, you're susceptible to disease. And we saw it actually in COVID. One of my researchers did a paper on the precursors of those most likely to suffer from COVID disease, and they were almost overwhelmingly, not entirely, but they were significantly associated with the conditions, the terrain, the former conditions of health of people who were attacked by the disease. Now that idea of terrain versus germ has been subject to almost the most ferocious debates within the history of medicine, and was supposed to have been won essentially by germ theory. Even through COVID, actually, the debates around the causes and the treatments were dominated by the idea that germ theory had told us this a long time ago. And here we had this COVID-19 virus. We were clearly able to identify it. We could clearly find a vaccine. We could clearly knock on its head. That's another victory for germ theory. And yet, even that victory of germ theory over the theory of the terrain has two lessons for us. One is that it didn't come accidentally, and I want to make this point. It owes a lot to this particular report, the Flexner report on medical education in the United States and Canada, which extolled the rigor of scientific lab-based medicine. It professionalized modern medicine. It made it something which was disciplinary protected. It made it something where you had to be following these rules. The rules were broadly a medicine that drew its strength from lab-based work, and that was broadly anchored in germ theory. And it outlawed, in the same token, this one report outlawed naturopathy. It outlawed ideas about the terrain mattering. It outlawed ideas about disease being a part of our healing process. It outlawed ideas that there is a natural healing process in the body, which will, if we look after the conditions of that, will bring us back to health. And it did it with some good intent. There were a lot of charlatans, there were a lot of quacks, there was a lot of what purported to be medicine, which actually wasn't doing people much good. So the idea of professionalizing it is not in itself a bad one. But here's one of the most interesting things. It was funded by Carnegie and Rockefeller at a point in time in which those people were looking for markets for different kinds of products, having created already more or less monopolistic markets in minerals, in oil, in resources. They were looking for a market, and the market they found through this piece of work was the market for pharmaceuticals. And I want to come back to why that isn't always a good thing. I want to point to a significant shift in the profile of industry, the profile of industry and the profile of health and the profile of medicine and the profile of disease, which is called the epidemiological transition. I did warn you that I'm going into some philosophical side routes here. I'm going to come back, I promise you. But the point of this is to show that what medicine has to deal with now is significantly different than what it had to deal with back when our National Health Service in the UK was formed, for its instance. And in those days, the germ theory idea of what medicine should be doing was relatively strongly supported by the evidence. It was mainly about treating infectious disease or workplace accidents. But what's happened subsequently is a massive rise in what is called chronic non-communicable diseases. And that massive rise in non-communicable diseases is not amenable to pharmaceutical solutions. There is no lab in which you can find a germ for diabetes, obesity, or heart disease, or musculoskeletal diseases, and in which you can find a drug that will kill the germ. It is not germ-associated. It is terrain-associated. And so the absence of a medical system and a system of health that prioritizes the idea of terrain is deeply difficult when it comes to dealing with the epidemiological burden, the burden of disease that our health systems now have to face. Now, there's something, the second thing that I wanted to really underline to you about this, which is going back to Asclepius and Hygeia. We have a medical system that basically prioritizes Asclepius. And it prioritizes Asclepius because the subjugation of germs with disease, germs with drugs, was something that at a certain point in time in 1910, when the Flexner Report was written, provided the market for pharmaceuticals, a growing market for pharmaceuticals. It was fit with the zeitgeist. It was the early days of capitalism. We wanted growing markets. The point of prosperity was to increase growth so we had enough income to spend on these kinds of things. And look, the development of these kinds of things would give us growth. They would give us growth rates. And if you want to see the evidence for that, actually, it's kind of here in what I call here the careless economy. What I think I'm trying to say is that through this process, the prioritization of one kind of model of health, a prioritization of one kind of model of the economy, the pursuit of growth, sometimes growth at all costs, we end up in a careless place. And let me just illustrate that. It's not that it doesn't come with its gains, this careless economy. And you can see them here. These are conventional, well, they are growth rates that would delight conventional economists. On the left-hand side of the graph, the blue bars there, they are the growth rates, the projected growth rates associated with certain kinds of foodstuffs, bread and cereal, sweets and snacks, oils and fats, ready meals, and ultra-processed foods. And the growth rates of 6, 7, 8, more than 8, almost 9% a year, way above what the GDP is growing at. This is an engine of growth. This is something we should be encouraging, right? Because it will give us back the growth that will lead to prosperity, we'll have our wealth, and society will be better off. Up to a point, if it wasn't making us ill. The very things on the left-hand side are the things that are now making us ill. And the growth rates on the right-hand side are painkillers, statins, proton pump inhibitors, which are for indigestion of various kinds, metformin, which is to treat diabetes, and then the new mecca almost of pharmaceutical growth, fantastic growth rates projected for anti-obesity drugs, all as a result of all the growth that we've had from the food growth rates on the left-hand side of the graph. In other words, the careless economy is not characterized by a vision that has no logic to it. The logic is that we pursue the things that give us growth, and that will give us more prosperity. And look, these are growth in the food industry, growth in big food, growth in ultra-processed foods, and at the same time, because it's making us all sick, growth in all the pharmaceutical things that won't ever cure those diseases, those chronic diseases, because they're not amenable to cure in the same way that an infectious germ is. They will only ever treat the symptoms. That is not without its costs. And here comes the point, almost the entire point of the presentation, is that the careless economy has significant losses. And those losses are, yes, partly the destruction of the environment. Yes, partly the inequality that arises when you allow one set of people to pursue profit at any cost. But they also come in deeply tangible economic ways within the economy itself. This was a piece of work that I did for the Food Farming Countryside Commission a year or so ago, and I was drawn to this by sort of saying, well, I understand the history, I understand the philosophy, I understand that we've prioritized Asclepius and that we've denigrated Hygeia. I understand that it's become a particular medical system. What is the economic implication of that? And the economic implications are profound. On the left-hand side of this graph, at the bottom in the blue, that's roughly the money that we're spending on food in the UK. The red stuff above it is all the losses, the costs that we're incurring, because that food, that diet, that nutritional quality is failing to maintain our health. It's undermining our health. So you have losses associated with the health system, losses associated with the social care system, losses associated with productivity, people who are morbid before they are at the end of their working lives, unable to work further, and then the inherent human loss associated with being unwell for a long period later in your life. These are real economic and human losses, and you can put a number on them. That was the goal of the exercise, was to put a number on them, and the number is huge. The number is 3 times almost what we're spending on food, and it's 4 times what it would cost for the government in the UK to give every household in the land access to healthy food. The careless economy is a false economy. The careless economy is undermining itself. It's undermining itself everywhere, not just in terms of the resources that we won't have in the future, the damage that will be caused to the climate, but even to our own health. In the grip of the growth, obsession, and a view of medicine that is about pharmaceutical treatment, we are missing fundamentally economic things that are now undermining our health service and undermining the public purse. It is what my late friend and former colleague Herman Daly would call uneconomic growth. It's a careless economy that does not have our best interests at heart and whose motivation is largely associated with allowing the continued relentless pursuit of profit, even when it weaponizes our own psychology to sell us things that are making us sick, and all in the name of delivering economic growth. Why doesn't it happen? Coming back to that question, I'm almost finished now. I'm hoping that I've stimulated you enough to prompt a few ripples in that pond. Care is subjected to economic growth, not accidentally, not from time to time, but systematically. There's an institutional and structural reason for that. Care, as we found earlier, is about attention. Attention takes time, and time in capitalism is money. And so the set of activities in my care economy, that wonderful set of employment-rich activities, employment-rich is anathema to capitalism, because capitalism continually pursues the opposite. It pursues labor productivity. Labor productivity is the inverse of employment richness. And so in chasing jobs out of production, which is what labor productivity basically does, what digital technologies and AI may be doing increasingly in the future, is the opposite. It has an opposite force to the force that's needed to preserve the time that care and attention need. Care is gendered. You barely need me to say this. 70% of all care work, paid and unpaid, around the world is done by women. And there is a very strong argument, and it's been put very clearly by feminist authors, that that's a part of the reason why care is denigrated, why care work is poorly paid, why the conditions of work are appalling sometimes, and why care goes missing from government policy over and over again. And then this point also I want to come back to, that it's moralized. If we think about this as a moral thing, claiming the moral high ground for caring about this or caring about that, we end up actually paralyzed by the idea of it. If we think about it as a quintessential thing, and I want to really just finish on that, then we have to treat it differently in society. What shall we do about it? Walter Cannon, The Wisdom of the Body, 1932, the final chapter in the epilogue of that book. Might it not be useful to examine other forms of organization? This is the lesson we've learned from the human body, that this process of balance, of coming into balance, of homeostasis, is essential to survival. Might it not be useful to think that could play a role somewhere else? Could it play a role in industrial, domestic, or social, or economic view of our world? And my argument clearly is that it can, it should, and it must. It goes right back to the idea of care as a restorative force. This idea that the care is something embedded in the inorganic conditions that allowed for organic life. It's embedded in the organic life, the mechanism, the fundamental organizing principle through which we survive. And that if we ignore or undermine or overthrow, if we bypass that idea, we are undermining our own health, we're undermining our own prosperity. This idea of it being quintessential brings it right back into the immediate pragmatism of policy, and where we have to think about what the mechanisms of care are. First of all, attention. Second, restoration, restorative force. We have mechanisms which pay no attention to it. We have an economy that pays very little attention to it, that denigrates it. We don't have the observatory function of our own autonomic nervous system looking out to see whether we're in health or out of health, whether we're in balance or out of balance. And we penalize the forces that bring us back into balance. Those ideas are the two foundations for shifts in policy. And they have particularly practical considerations when we think of the financing of care. The obvious question is, well, how are you going to pay for all this? I would not expect you not to ask that question. But the answer to that is that how can you afford not to pay for it? This is a fundamental investment. And actually, even treating something as an investment in financial architecture means that you treat it differently in accounting terms. You can annuitize it. You can think of it as something stretched through time. You can think of it of something with longer returns. You can finance it differently in the architecture of many financial systems than you do current account spending. In other words, this perspective brings us right back to fundamental changes we could make, not just Monday, we could make them now, to the financial institutions, to the way they operate, to the fiscal rules that bind governments, and indeed to the legislative frameworks that frame what companies are doing. Care is an investment. And it also follows that it is an unpaid debt. It's an unpaid debt to those who gave care. It's an unpaid debt to the damage that the lack of care presented to ordinary human beings. There is an act, I would argue, of reparation that needs to happen around these realizations. And these are real, tangible policy implications. I want to just finish on the idea, and this is the last idea really from that physiological set of ideas. Care as freedom. How could care be freedom? Oh, you've been talking about limits. You've been talking about restoration of balances. You talk about regulatory mechanisms. What's that got to do with freedom? in The Wisdom of the Body, Cannon points out something which is kind of obvious, but counterintuitive. The regulatory systems of complex organisms like human beings are far more complex and more regulatory than those of simple beings. You think of an amoeba, it has very little to regulate. Sugar across the boundary, cell boundary, that's it. The human being has a whole set of regulatory mechanisms. What do those regulatory mechanisms do? They allow the freedom to move. They allow the freedom to operate. They allow us as human beings to go out into the world. They provide not just health, not just survival, but freedom. And that idea, which is a completely different idea from a freedom built on ever-increasing income and from ever-increasing material choices, seems to me to point us towards something very specific about the direction of human progress. We give up on the idea of accumulation. If we think more carefully about the idea of balance, if we build our economies around the idea of care, we are finally free to think more clearly about a social progress that represents a different kind of freedom, the freedom of relationship, the freedom to explore, the freedom of creativity, freedoms which are denigrated by the consumer capitalism we've inherited, freedoms to become more fully human. And that is a promise. It's not a done deal. It doesn't flow from anything that I say in this room or any stone that's dropped in any pond. But it does offer us a direction of progress that gives us back a sense of hope that the future is not a materialistic disaster zone that has been created by the profligate pursuit of more at any cost. It's a meaningful sense of freedom. It's a freedom that could be almost called spiritual. It's a freedom that allows the expression of the human spirit in ways that we have barely begun to explore. That's where I'm going to stop. I look forward to your questions and discussion.
I would like to start with one question from my side. Given that today's audience is mixed, it is not only economists here, and we are in this beautiful historical building of the University of Latvia, my first question would be related to the role of science. A French physicist, Aurélien Barraud, he talks often about Alexander Grothendieck, one of the brightest mathematicians of the 20th century, pointing out something that they share in common, and that's the audacity, probably disobedience, and their rebellion with respect to the scientific community of their respective time. Because they dare to question the purpose of the use of the scientific results, the type of businesses the financing comes from, and most importantly, they dare to question that firmly entrenched productivist view of the science, so which attributes the value to the scientific results mainly to the extent they can be commercialized, or at least they bring fame and awards to the institute. And in your work, you also touch upon the misuse of science. We saw the example of the medical industry, for example. So what do you think is the capacity of today's science to be the driving force for the mindsets, changes in mindsets, changes in institutions probably? So in order that the economy gets on track, with what we think a good life represents for us.
So I pick up a couple of slightly different themes to that question. The first is, can science be misused? And I think it clearly can. Second, more inquisitive in a way, more philosophical question, what then should science be? It should not be captured by any worldview. In fact, to me, science is a process. It's a process of inquiry. It's a process, I would say, of conjectures and refutations, which is not mine, but Karl Popper's. You put forward a theory about the world and you see whether it turns out to be right. You prove it, you disprove it, you look at the evidence. And that process of science, I think, has two aims. One is, of course, to improve society. But the other, which may in itself be deemed an improvement of society, is to pursue our knowledge about the world so that we don't live under illusions. And so it is the job of science, it seems to me, at any age, to challenge the wisdom of the previous ages, and in any discipline to challenge the wisdom of the discipline. And unfortunately, university systems don't work necessarily very effectively in that way. They tend to close disciplinary boundaries, to set up frameworks for the protection of the integrity of the discipline that actually operate against the process of science, because science should never be satisfied with discipline. And sometimes the other thing that those frameworks do is to prevent the transfer of exchange of knowledge, exchange of ideas between disciplines. When you close your disciplinary boundaries, when you make a kind of expert language that only you speak and you then refuse to speak to anyone else, or they can't talk to you because they don't understand the language, that stands in the way of science. So I've worked in the university most of my life. I applaud the university system where it works. But I do think we have to be very careful about maintaining the scientific integrity of our scientific disciplines. And that involves skepticism constantly.
Thank you. Thank you for your reflection. And, well, I have many questions to go on like this for hours probably, but I'm sure there's so many burning questions in the audience. And may I ask, please raise your hand, and there's a person with a microphone on each side of the... There's 1 and 2 for the moment. Wait. 3, 4. Okay. The person with the microphone, could you please approach? There was the hand which is now up. Yeah, there. Maybe while the microphone is coming, I will ask another brief...
There's somebody with a microphone.
Is it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting perspective and the question raised actually. I think most of the audience buys your idea. But I have a question. I kind of see that people usually don't look for collective benefits. People are selfish. They look for their own good. This is the world we live in. And what you proposed in your theory was that, it's obvious interest of people to live healthy life and make choices for them to live long. And if I convert this idea to the public policies, it would be a wise thing for governments to do, to shift our policies which benefit the people so that they live healthy, the costs for healthcare and healthcare decreases, and they live longer just because they live more balanced life. This is the main message you are giving. But if we look in the real life, yes, let's look at European policies. The UK is now, for Kiev adopted this, but you can observe it as well. We have CO2 problem, climate problem. Europe in last period issued the Green Deal policies, which are right in philosophy, but they kind of provide or bring a collective benefit. Collectively, if we act correctly, we help the planet. But if you convert it individually, in the short run, we are kind of losers. We pay more for fuel, for heating the houses, many aspects of life cost more. So in short run, we are losers. Why do governments choose to put so much resource on long-term benefits instead of motivating people or making policies that motivates people to get short-term gains? And inversely, we also give good for the long-term benefits. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very fair question to ask. It's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I think one challenge to it is the kind of the assumption that all that's going on is about individual short-term interest. And I think The difficulty with that is when we look at the world around us, that's kind of what we see. But do we see that because it's in our nature, and that's our nature as human beings, or do we see it because it's the kind of society that we live in? And one of the bits of evidence that I like to bring to this as a debate is actually that it is not intrinsically the core characteristics of human beings. It is much more so the characteristic of the kind of society that we have. And that's not to pretend that individuals don't have selfish behaviors. That's absolutely clear. But when you look at the psychological evidence, what you find, and this is a place where I like the work of Shalom Schwartz, is that he pitches the human psyche as being torn between two tensions. One is selfishness, selfish interest now, and the other is altruism, that tension between self and other, and a tension between a kind of novelty-seeking, grasp the moment, and a tension between tradition and conservation. And when you look at those two tensions, and you look at the way of describing the human psyche, what leaps out at me is the way that we, within late capitalism, have described what human beings are like, is to focus on selfish, novelty-seeking hedonism. In other words, one side of each of those tensions, and basically to ignore what's going on in the rest. The reason why that's wrong is partly because that is not what describes human beings. And you're denigrating the other parts of human behavior that actually still, even as everyone's out for their own interest, are looking after sick people, who are bringing up kids, who are giving their time away to meaningless things that apparently have no economic virtue whatsoever. And our system has prioritized, rewarded, incentivized that novelty-seeking individual hedonism. So, yes, engaging in policies that challenge that selfish individual is very, very difficult at the moment. But that doesn't mean to say that it's an impossible thing to do. It means that we actually have to look at the structure and the formulation of that idea of the human that sits inside our economics, sits inside our policy. Practically and pragmatically, it means that you cannot simply, as government, impose conditions on people, particularly poor people, that makes their life worse. It means you have to take those things into account. I mean, I've worked for a long time in energy policy, a long time in policies around carbon taxes. The evidence comes back again and again when you talk to people, when you engage in studies. If your intervention is the imposition of something which restricts people's lives further, they will resist that. They will resent it. They will work against it. If you accept that there are costs, that those costs have to be borne most oftenly by poor people, that you subsidize to avoid them having worse lives, if you provide the conditions for a better life, if you build your policy not just about some short-term incentive, but actually about the improvement of the quality of life, then you find that those kinds of things become more acceptable. So you're appealing to that self-interest by making it more acceptable, but at the same time, you're developing a sense in society that we are not just novelty-seeking hedonists. We're not just selfish beings. And a lot of our economy actually survives and thrives only because we're not those people. And that seems to me as an important lesson for policy as anything else.
Thank you. Has microphone reached that person in the rear part?
Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting, and I wanted to connect it with the news. I read yesterday that Gen Z males consider that if the women should obey them, or in a way they presented this more traditionalist worldview than the woman generation. And I immediately connected this to the future of no jobs, because we are moving very fast in that direction. And it's a very rational willingness to have this more traditional lifestyle, that the women stay home and the men can have their last jobs out there in the world, right? And somehow also your lecture today felt like a continuation of this idea that there will be no jobs, and that this care is a rational and pragmatic thing to do, because instead of the jobs, we will care. So either in the future we will care or obey, or something like that. So maybe you can comment on that. Thanks.
Oh, Well, I apologize if that's the way it came across. I don't feel, I do understand that evidence you're citing. I've seen it myself. I find it terrifying. But this, what I was talking about, was definitely not an appeal to a jobless society in which we force care back into the home and on people who aren't paid for it, and in particular women. That's absolutely not. There is a strand in the work, in the book itself, which in quite graphic language dismisses that idea and challenges what I would call patriarchal views. And I think that the tendency of Gen Z to kind of return to some of those patriarchal views is a big mistake. It's a huge mistake. It's a part of what's denigrated care. It's a part of what has created gender inequality. And it's certainly not something I'm espousing. I see it. And I see the big challenge of the theme of the care economy that I'm talking about. I see it as being at the whim of a kind of toxic masculinity. And I stand here as a man saying that, accepting that as a man I'm part of it. And it was one of the biggest struggles that I have in writing the book, is that I was writing it as a man. But I am certainly not in the position of advocating that view that's increasingly being put forward, at least by some Gen Z men. And I don't think that's ubiquitous either. I think there are different views amongst young men, some of which are much more open to the kinds of ideas that I've been talking about. Care is part of the danger of the moralization of care. Is we think of care in that moralized way, then we can continually push it into a moralized corner as something unimportant to the mainstream policy, unimportant to productive life, that the jobs doesn't matter if we don't pay them. That's the opposite of what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot. And so, as an economist, there is always a question, so what? Okay? What are we going to do about it? And in your speech, presentation, it was very clear that it's very much about the quality of life rather than nominal growth of the economy. By and large, if I understand it correctly, one way to look at this is there is, in a way, good growth and there is bad growth, if there is growth. Okay? And if we take a look at the bad growth, then it's a trap. Like the example that you showed in terms of the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, that we treat symptoms rather than causes. And at the end of the day, it's going to become increasingly expensive and it's going to run out of money. So to avoid this trap, one needs to look into the causes, to address those, rather than deal with the symptoms, which is just temporarily relieving the problem rather than resolving this. But what would you point as other directions of traps? This health itself, healthcare industry itself, in your example, NHS, is one. Where else do you see that expectations of growth is simply a trap and generating the wrong type of growth, which is not benefiting the improvement of the quality of life, healthy years of life, or whatever way you measure it? That's question one. And question two, if we really haven't run out of nominal economic growth, real growth, there is no sufficient productivity growth, where do you see that we are at risk? What are those institutional elements of economies that will run short and will really be good?
Yeah. Again, really good questions. I mean, on the first one, I think the difficulty is that you can see it almost everywhere, that almost everything that is lionized as being central to the economy is driven by things which, yes, can certainly be seen to be generating some profit, some growth in the economy, but also have downsides. I mean, the drill, baby, drill philosophy of the new US government has a downside, which is very, very obvious in terms of climate impact. The materialistic economy has... when I was on my way here, I walked through Gatwick Airport in London, and you cannot, and then I arrived in Riga, and I have to say how wonderful it was to arrive in Riga. But when I was departing through Gatwick Airport in London, I was shepherded through duty-free sales, not just in a straight line with duty-free on either side, but in a big circle, the biggest arc that could be taken, so that I would be exposed as much as possible to the sales pitches of the duty-free, an economy that is built around the domination of public space with commercial activity in pursuit of growth. That's also, in my mind, one of those places where we're undermining our sense of, our basic sense of space, of public space, through the commercialization of it. The technologies that are dangerous to our kids, which we have failed to regulate over and over again, knowing that they are causing almost immediate harms, and that there are links between the overuse of those technologies and the rising burden, an epidemic of mental health issues in young people. I could point, and this is a difficult place to do it, but I would also point to, and I had a slide about it, that the end game of a resource-intensive economy is ultimately always going to lead us in and towards conflict, because a conflict for resources of one kind, of land, of minerals, of fossil fuels, even of intellectual property, is a zero-sum game in which people will have ultimately to compete with each other to win the gains, the economic gains that they're looking for. And yet we've also built economies that profit from that. The slide that I skipped over was comparing the costs of the EU's Health for All programme, which was in the matter of a few billion, with the projected costs of the rearmament programme, which was approaching trillions of euros. And that's a very difficult thing to say. I understand that, particularly in this country here right now, to say that. But I think we should still be questioning the logic of a system whose dynamic leads us towards progress, and then the lionization of a military arms industry that profits massively from only one product, which is the destruction of property and life. That is a dynamic that, we have to live with. It's a dynamic that we have to think very carefully about. And my answer is almost everywhere. And you look in the economy, the sectors that are seen as the prize of the economy are ones which are conveying damage, that are weaponizing our psychology, that are undermining our health, that are driving us towards conflict. And I find that absolutely frightening. I find it a very dangerous place to be. Your second question was... sorry, Martin, your second question was more around the policy response. Yes, no, that's also a really good question. I as a former advisor to the UK government, I was very sensitized to this, is that you can't just turn off a system, a social system, an economic system, a policy system, a policy direction by simply saying, yeah, we've been going for growth, I say we stop having growth. It's not about turning off growth in some way. It is about understanding where our growth dependencies lie. And your point was a very good one, which is if we have different indicators, if we have health as an indicator, then we are not necessarily looking after this growth. And if this growth doesn't happen, then there are places where our institutions are going to suffer, is absolutely true. We live inside what I would call a growth dependency. Our institutions are growth dependent, our politics are growth dependent, our financial system is growth dependent. Something very simple like social care becomes growth dependent because it relies essentially on increasing public flows being put into private companies to deliver care, which may or may not solve the underlying problems, but are making the shareholders of those private equity companies incredibly rich. That is a growth-dependent system. It's a growth-dependent way of organizing social care. It's not the only one. So our job, in response to your question, is first to understand where those growth dependencies arise, and second, to make our systems as growth independent as possible, not to try to destroy growth, not to try to chase some kind of vision of degrowth, not to overturn the system, because in overturning the system, we are probably creating even more social ilth, but actually to understand and to shift the dependencies of the system so they become less growth dependent. And that's a very sensible thing to do in a world in which we don't have the growth that we would like to have, even without all these fine considerations of prosperity as health and climate protection. We're living in a world, as I said during the lecture, where we're living in a post-growth world, but we still have growth-based institutions, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, but just to sum up, if I may add to the idea of good and bad growth. Now, in Latvia, the average income level is 1.8 times the world average, yet only 70% of the EU average. So we have a long history of being a catching-up economy in desperate need of growth. And for many people, prosperity could still mean the possibility to buy the gaze of others. And in a post-growth world, how could it be possible for society to agree upon a different, yet more or less common vision of what prosperity means? And what are the tasks to do to reach this goal?
Again, I think that's a really interesting question. To me, that's a kind of democratic project. It's not really a project, and in some ways, I could put forward my vision of what people should aspire to, but that clearly isn't democratic. It's clearly, not something that would have any authority. I mean, your point, the way you phrased the question was very interesting, because you sort of said we can agree on it. But I wonder to what extent we do agree on it, this existing vision.
It was my question, yeah, whether it's possible at all.
Well, whether it's possible at all, but whether the one that you said was relatively easy for us to agree on because it's what we have, actually whether we do really agree on that, whether that is satisfying our needs, whether that vision of a materialistic consumer society in which we have more and that indicates status, and status is good, so I feel better, and so everything is fine. It misses the fact that actually in Western societies in particular, we have rising mental health disorders. If that were a legitimate route towards prosperity and some form of life satisfaction or happiness, why would we be seeing that? So that, I guess, a part of the reason for engaging in it is a recognition that actually the idea of prosperity that we have, the idea of a materialistic consumerism, the idea that in having more, I'm better off, is fundamentally uncomfortable at some deep level of the human psyche, precisely because that is not all we are. Now, of course, the presentation of the existing system, the presentation of prosperity as material cornucopia, if you like, endless material possibility, is something that is difficult for us to escape. It's ubiquitous. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our culture. We see it in Hollywood. We see it in Netflix streamed at us from everywhere. We see it around us. We want to compare to other people. I would argue that this is the hijacking of the human psyche to do exactly what I was arguing before in the first question, to narrow down the idea of what prosperity is to this selfish, hedonistic, novelty-seeking behavior, individualistic behavior, at the expense of our social nature, at the expense of our deeper nature, at the expense of a sense of meaning and purpose in life, at the expense of our creativity, at the expense of the number of things we could do if we allowed ourselves this freedom, this care as freedom ethic that I'm talking about. And so what I would expect, both that the simple vision of a materialistic prosperity that we can all agree on is fractured. It's fractured already, because ultimately, even if we say we agree on it, our mental health is almost the counterexample to that as a species, and our sense of disenfranchisement, our sense of disempowerment, our sense of resentment of different sections of the population, our sense of conflict with each other, our fear for the future in which aggression is becoming ever more relevant to us. That's already the fracturing of that simple, agreed vision of prosperity. And in its place, we have the possibility to put in place something that is meaningful, something that is shared, something that in which relationship comes to the fore, something where we can actually return to a sense of hope about the future. And I don't think it's possible to describe that in one word or in my vision, but I absolutely believe it's something worth striving for as a society.
Thank you once again. Thank you for sharing your work and your thoughts with us. And we will be left with a lot of material to process by Monday and further on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.